Hello, and welcome to our podcast on social science classifications. Let's go ahead and see what we're talking about here. So to begin, the study of the social sciences is a humongous undertaking, is a humongous subject. And so we really try as social scientists, as historians, political scientists, economists, sociologists, or psychologists, those are all social science people. We try to compartmentalize or to classify issues with smaller labels in order to more easily discuss them and how they interact with each other. And so a general overarching classification way is to divide things into the political, the social, and the economic. And you'll see each one has its own groupings within each label, but then there are also a lot of overlaps between those. And so if we can pick things apart and look at them as individual pieces and analyze as parts, then it makes it easier to reattach them for the whole. And so like we said, the world itself is just way too big to digest at once. And when we actually start to study things, it is easier to break them down into more manageable parts. Rather than just saying, well, the world is going great, or the world is going horribly, we could look at it in different categories. We could start to say, well, here's what's going on in the social realm of the world. Here's what's going on in the political realm. Here's what's going on in the economic realm. And if we can look at those parts individually, then we can start to cobble those together and be able to make some sort of deeper analysis of the whole. And it's also important for us to be able to see relationships between elements, so causes and effects. Why do things happen? Not just because something magically causes them. There's a reasonable, logical chain of events that is probably pushing something to happen now. And so we can talk about how the political can cause social issues and how the social realm can cause economic benefits and see how all of these interact with each other. But until we give them names and start to compartmentalize, it's very difficult to juggle everything at once. So how are we going to break apart this whole into smaller pieces? Well, we are using the political, economic, social classification system. There are many other acronyms that you could use to layer onto society. Some explicitly mention things like technology or the arts, and we would simply argue that technology and the arts are embedded within the political, economic, and social categorizing. So nothing's gone if we don't explicitly label it, but these umbrella terms will help us divide this massive looking at society into smaller parts so that we can be more specific. And we certainly want to start looking at and asking ourselves, where are there primary groupings, but then also where are there overlaps? And while there are some right answers for things, there are many different places where interpretation is needed and where it is valid. And so the ultimate exercise is for us to think and to contemplate why we would put X, Y, or Z as a political element, whereas somebody might try to see it as a social element. It doesn't really matter. It is what it is. But the exercise of thinking and debating and contemplating, that's what's important for our brain. So here's what each category is, and these are the big things that fit into those as a primary element. So for example, the political category, these deal with government. And so that's going to be all levels of government, federal, state, and local. We're going to look at campaigns, we're going to look at voting, we're going to be looking at what government does, maybe what they should do, maybe what they should not do. We're going to look at the people in government. So if a congressperson says something, that's political. If a police officer says something, that is political. If a judge does something, if the president does something, if the military commanders do something, those are all political category items. And we'll also be able to take a look at the political arm of the idea of taxes. Since governments impose taxes on people, then it becomes a political element. The next category we tend to look at is the economic category. And so these deal with money and the financial realm. So again, money. So the cash you have in your pocket, the credit cards, the checking account, the savings account, stocks, bonds, investments, retirement funds, things like that. But we also have taxes. So even though we labeled taxes as a political thing, they are also very obviously an economic thing as well. We could be looking at banks, how banks work. We could be looking at jobs, which jobs are growing, which are shrinking, which aren't going to be needed in the year 2050, which are going to be needed more of in 2050 than are currently needed now. The general economy, and then the concept of unemployment. So even if it's not about having cash in hand or holding a penny or a quarter, all of these things will fall into that economic category. And then the social category is one of the bigger ones, but also one of the more confusing because it's a little bit more abstract. In general, the social category deals with culture, people, and groups, or the interactions of those groups. So if you start to talk about race issues, if you talk about how religions see the world, if you talk about gender and sexuality, languages people speak, crime and deviance, or who has power within groups, that technically fits into that social category. But you can certainly see, and hopefully the wheels are turning already, you can see how those overlap with other categories as well. Because if you're going to say that this group has more power than this group, that's a social thing. But then if the powerful group starts to impose laws on somebody else, then that becomes political. If they use the police to enforce those laws, that is political as well. If getting a job is dependent on which group you are in, it's clearly social to begin because you're talking about groups. If you have police enforcing a law about who can and can't get a job, that becomes political. But then the concept of jobs itself is also going to be an economic issue. And a large part of the social category is this idea of culture. So it's not so much about groups, but it's just kind of like what people do. So the idea of pop culture, like whatever the coolest app is right now, that's pop culture. Now there could be political and economic implications of this, but we would consider cool apps under pop culture. Hairstyles, clothing styles, piercing styles, music, movies, books. That's what people do. Those aren't necessarily groups of people, as our previous definition of social talked about, but this is an element of that social category that oftentimes students think like, well, to be social is to hang out with people. That is true, but in terms of how we're classifying things, we tend to put a lot of group interactions, but then also cultural items within that social overarching category. And so for the visual learners out there, you can see here are our three categories: political, economic, and social, but you can also see how they overlap. You could have some entity that has just political implications. More likely, you're going to have something that is political, but also impacts our economy. Something that is political, but also is changing the way groups interact. And you could certainly have entities that have all three very strongly represented in them. And again, the game is not to take some idea, person, group, whatever, throw them in the category and then be done with it. That's not, there's no answer key here like, oh, I have correctly placed that Apple Corporation is an economic issue. Yay, I'm done. That's just the part of it. The bigger part is, well, why did you put them there? Why didn't you include the fact that they help shape social customs in our nation through their commercials, through their popularity with certain age groups? But then also, why didn't we talk about the lobbying potential of a large corporation? That becomes political. So there isn't necessarily one right answer we're trying to get to. It's the mental exercise of trying to figure out and then explain why any part of society fits in one or multiple of these categories. So let's do a little bit of practice here. Where would each term primarily fit? So if we had to take these three terms and put them into one category only, what is going to be the most obvious category for each? Go ahead and take a minute, pause the podcast, and see if you can figure out where each one would go. And here's what we would argue. The president primarily is a political position. A paycheck is primarily an economic issue, and a church is primarily a social issue. So if we had to put each item in only one category, these would be the three we would put them in. Right, so now a little bit more practice, a little bit more abstract. Explain how each could fit into many categories. You have a court case dealing with voting rights, a professional sports team, a president giving a speech about the economy, or a court case involving a white police officer shooting an African-American woman. So take a minute, pause the podcast, take all four of them. Where would you place each of them into multiple categories, and why? And while your answers could be wide and varied because we see these issues in a variety of different ways, let's just take one to look at real quick. How about a professional sports team? I would probably look at that originally as an economic issue. That is what professional sports are. While they are created for people to enjoy an activity, ultimately they are private industries and they are designed to make money. Fine. So it's an economic thing. People are paid to play on the team. People are paid to coach, to be trainers. People pay money to get into the games through tickets. People pay to buy concessions. People pay to park their car. So there's a large infrastructure that supports a professional sports team just economically. But can a sports team also be political? Well, with people protesting police brutality by taking a knee during the national anthem, does that act become political? Do some teams choose to do that, where many players are choosing to make that a political act by saying, I don't like how police are treating people, so I'm going to use my job to protest? Yes. Are there other teams where a majority of players choose not to make that protest, choose not to take that knee? Also, yes. There are laws that govern what can and can't happen in private companies. And these are, in essence, private companies. The National Football League is a company. Major League Baseball is a company. And so there are laws, and once you have laws in play, that is political. And if somebody wants to question the law, like, can I be fired as a baseball player if whatever? If there's a question about that, it might go to a court system. A court system definitely within the political realm. So we have something seemingly pretty cut and dried as a professional sports team, but there could be ways to explain how it originally fits in the economic realm, but has reaches into many of the other realms as well. And so again, there is no one right answer as we're doing this. It's about taking an idea, breaking it into its parts, doing a little compartmentalizing, doing a lot of thinking, doing a lot of explaining and justifying as to where you see it fit into one or many of these realms. And then ideally moving us towards seeing the many great connections within our world and thinking deeply about all of our world. That's the point. Whether we use PES or something with technology and arts in specific also listed, doesn't really matter. But can we see how some element intersects with a lot of other elements in our world? So I think that's it. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, please bring those in the class. Otherwise, we will see you soon and do some practicing. Thanks.